Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma. My name is Will Inboden. I'm the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security and a professor here at the University of Texas at Austin. And we're privileged to have as today's guest and discussion partner my good friend, Dr. Maeve Ryan, who is dialing in from London. Maeve is a faculty member in the Venerable War Studies Department at King's College London, a valued academic partner of us here at the University of Texas, and is also the director of the Center for Grand Strategy there. So she's been a wonderful teacher to a number of our current students and alums, and is a very accomplished scholar in her own right. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about her background, but especially most of our discussion will be on her terrific new book published recently with Yale University Press, Humanitarian Governance in the British Antislavery World System. And so it's going to be a deep dive into geopolitics and foreign policy and fraught moral issues in the 19th century. And given that a lot of our discussions on this podcast are a little more present focused in current policy issues, it is fun to, on occasion, take a deeper dive into history, especially 19th century British imperial history. So, Maeve, welcome to the show. It is great to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So let's start, before we get into the book itself, let's just start a little bit with you. Tell us a little bit about your own personal professional background and then your current roles there at King's College London.
So first and foremost, I guess I am a historian based in King's College London, as you said, in the Department of War Studies. And I consider myself very lucky to be based here because it's a position that gives me an opportunity to really indulge my interests, my wildly divergent academic interests. I think, a lot of academics want to do that, and I'm very lucky in the sense that I can, much more, I think, than is usual in my role. So I get to sort of be two quite different things. I get to be a 19th century historian, first and foremost, and really looking a lot at the history of British foreign policy, diplomatic history, history of international relations more broadly. I started looking at that, empire in the Atlantic world, and I'm looking then now my more recent work more towards the Indian Ocean and what we would now call the Indo-Pacific region. And I've had a long-standing interest in the hegemonic transition between the British Empire and what came after. And then, in the last few years, I've kind of moved as much as I possibly can from the 19th century into the 20th century and even into the 21st century, and thinking about some of these big themes and sort of post-imperial legacies, and even things around climate change and international order. So it's quite a big portfolio of academic interests that I do on my own. And then separately to that, I'm sort of, I guess, in tandem with that, I am the co-director of the Center for Grand Strategy. I joined King's 5 years ago, and with my colleague John Bew set up this centre, and have had the opportunity to grow it from essentially just the two of us and an idea on the back of an envelope to a really vibrant research community, loads of absolutely terrific early career scholars and some wonderful colleagues too that have come together into this research community. And through that, I get to do a lot of thinking about themes around grand strategy, as I say, around international order, but also to engage with policy communities, in a way that actually John Bew was an inspiration for me and has been a mentor for me. There are very few, grad students looking at and studying the 19th century British Empire and thinking that that's going to have relevance, that you're going to become someone who's relevant to policy communities. And I've had just the really good fortune of being able to try to grow that sort of work too. And so it's a big part of what I'm doing now. So.
Yeah, terrific. And of course, John, I'm glad you mentioned John, since he's well known and a friend certainly to me and to many others of us involved with the Clements Center and Horns of a Dilemma. And of course, is currently serving as a senior policy advisor at number 10 Downing Street. So I know, is right now embodying that application of historical insight to current policy challenges. And there have been no shortage of policy challenges, as we know. So.
Yes, indeed.
So let's turn now to your book, and I guess but let's also begin with the beginning. Tell us about the origins of your book as an intellectual project. Like, where did you get the idea for this, and how did the research and writing and arguments of the book evolve over time? A number of our listeners are either current doctoral students or other scholars or policymakers who like to read scholarship. And so we're especially eager to hear about how one scholar, in this case you, has approached your craft on this really important work.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm hoping that some of the people listening to this podcast will also be deans and people who get to set the tone for early career scholars and set some of the expectations, because what I would say about this particular book is that it was a long time in the making, and I think because of my good fortune at having a position at King's, actually took a bit more time to do it than I think early career people are really encouraged to. So I didn't it grew from my PhD, but I didn't, turn it around in a year and publish it as quickly as possible, which I know a lot of people have to do in order to get their job. So I guess what I would say is, if at all, if you possibly can at all, to take that extra bit of time and turn that doctoral project into something much bigger, connect it with much bigger themes, really think about the so what, and take the time to write it in a way that you feel really proud of. I mean, that is obviously that's everybody's dream, and I know not everybody has the good fortune to be able to do that.
Quick interjection there, by the way. All right, any deans or department chairs or other senior academic officials listening, you heard the word from Dr. Ryan there. So very, very important. Take the time to invest in and support your junior scholars and give them that extra year or 2 or 3 they may need to take what might be a decent book and make it into a really first-rate one. Okay, back to you.
Absolutely. I would love to see that happen. And in my position now as a kind of mid-career, and I get to have that great role of mentoring younger scholars too, this is something that's a big priority for me, to try to create that space for them. So I really hope that happens more broadly across the industry. This particular project grew actually from my master's work. I studied history as an undergraduate, actually history and English literature in Trinity College Dublin, where I got the bug for working with, working very closely with primary sources, which in the history department there you do from second year undergraduate. That's what you're really focusing on. I was mentored by someone called Professor Patrick Gagan and by Professor Jane Ohlmeyer, and they really instilled this love of trying to do something really original from the very beginning, from second year of a 4-year degree. I then went on to do a master's in international relations and was mentored by Professor Brendan Sims at Cambridge. And I mention that because I, from the very beginning of my career, really wanted to be a historian who really engaged with all of this primary stuff, but thinking about the applications and thinking about connecting that with bigger questions and bigger contemporary questions. And Brendan Sims obviously is someone who kind of exemplifies that. He's someone who's a very, very well-established 18th, 19th century historian, but who also connects with those questions too. And so from the very beginning of working with him, he was encouraging me to look for the sorts of research questions that were going to have that kind of contemporary significance, and something that you could really get into and do something original in its own right. Again, it's sort of like the holy grail, I think, in some ways, of being a historian. And what he nudged me towards, which was not actually something that was on my radar, was the question of the abolition of the slave trade as a diplomatic and sort of international legal question of significance. It's sort of casually mentioned in the literature on the period of the early 19th century that Britain's Royal Navy suppression campaign, the West Africa Squadron, sent out the police, and to try to suppress the transatlantic slave trade, that this caused friction between Britain and other powers, notably France, the United States, and then Spain, Portugal, and Brazil, and others too. And he asked me to really think about and look into the sources, to get into the foreign office files and the National Archives, and really test this question of, did it actually cause Britain any problems? Did it actually create international legal or diplomatic friction or ramifications? So I went into this in my master's dissertation, really, really dug deep into this. But in the course of that, I became really curious about, as these slave ships are being seized by the Royal Navy in the aftermath of the 1807 Abolition Act, being seized on the West African coast, and there is all of this stuff that flows from it in the diplomatic and policy space. A lot of the work that was written on this, the secondary literature that was written about this, mentioned the people, the enslaved people on those slave ships, being disembarked at Freetown or disembarked somewhere, and then the diplomatic story moved on. So after I finished my master's, I started really thinking, is there more to this, and has there been more written about this, and what kind of happened to those people, but what happened in the policy space too? The Abolition Act was extremely brief about what should be done with those people, but clearly you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and so what sort of infrastructures and ideas emerged in response to it, and in what ways did those people force the British Empire or any of the other receiving territories to think differently about kind of what the state was for and how they could be accommodated. So that was the seed of the idea. I followed it through my PhD. Lots of twists and turns, and it changed shape and scope. And then the PhD that emerged from it was the beginning of the book. But as I say, I really went back and rewrote every line of it, expanded the scope of it, did a lot more original research. The book is dedicated to Matt, Ted, and Sam. Matt is my husband, Ted is my 4-year-old, and Sam is my 2-year-old. When I started thinking about these questions, I hadn't met any of those people. So it's been a long time in the making.
Yeah. So they were grafted into the book process. But I do want to, again, just give a strong emphasis to a point you made there, especially for either any doctoral advisors who are listening, or younger doctoral students who are still casting about for a dissertation topic or a master's student for a thesis. You made that really important point of how partly as Professor Sims had guided you to look more deeply into this, and so the act abolishing the slave trade is put in place. The British Navy starts enforcing it. They are, rescuing, if you will. And I know each of these terms are contested, so we'll come back to that. But as a shorthand, enslaved people, and then you said, and then leaving, depositing them in Sierra Leone or other places, and then moving on. And that little "and then moving on" within that is contained such a vast and fascinating set of questions about their own agency, what happens to them, what the British were intending for them. And of course, that was the seeds of your project. And so for others listening, thinking about these, look for those gaps in the historical record, right? Look for where an event happens, and then it is a passing reference is made, or and then other things move on, and ask you, wait a minute, what are we missing there? What individual human beings, what policies, what are we overlooking there? And then it sounds like that was turned into a long and very deep and fruitful historical inquiry for you.
It was, and actually the original title of my PhD, which, as I say, really fundamentally changed between there and the book. But the original title was very long and wordy, but it included the term human consequences. And I think this was something that I suppose I was trying to get to grips with, the question of what is that's in that space between the framing of a policy and the way it's written down, which is a very alluring thing for historians to look at the policy, to think about the policy as it was thought about. But I think quite a lot fewer words are written about the implementation of a policy. I think, as we all know, it's true in the present day. Everyone wants to look at the strategy and not the implementation. Everyone wants to look at the policy planners, but not the the delivery people. And I think that's really it's certainly something that I didn't go into it expecting to be so intrigued by, but actually that was a big part of the project, was thinking about what happens to the policy when it confronts reality, and especially because what's called the disposal of these people, the disposal policy, was implemented in so many different sites around the Atlantic world and in the Indian Ocean too. And in each of those places, very different local circumstances shaped different sorts of elaborations of that policy into practice, very different sorts of motivations on the part of the people who were seeking to control and contain and rehabilitate these individuals, but also those people who were brought there were coming from all over. I mean, in terms of ethno-linguistic backgrounds, you're talking about people who were enslaved Africans who were being trafficked from regions as diverse as just south of the Sahara, right down toward the tip of Africa, and then really quite far inland. And so you're
thousands and thousands of miles of distance.
Oh yeah, absolutely. People being trafficked through a number of different stages to the coast, and then being being sold. And so you're talking about a very diverse groups of people on kind of both sides of that divide. And so coming to terms with that is obviously a huge study.
Yeah. Well, and we started to get into some of your particular findings and arguments there, and we're going to circle back to those for sure. But because we historians, I'm speaking as a fellow historian here, if you hear, we're all about context, right? So set the scene for us. Give our listeners the important features and contours of the geopolitical context of the time that you're writing about, this early 19th century, or even if you want to start with late 18th century, because what is the geopolitical context in which the British Empire and its wielding of naval power, and then this very interesting movement, and in some ways very problematic movement comes along? So what's the world look like at the time?
Very, very interesting question. And now begins my 2-hour lecture. No, kidding.
Okay.
It's a very interesting question. So a number of different features really shape the context in which the Abolition Act kind of comes into being, and then and where it's being implemented. The first is one that we call the loss of the American colonies on this side of the water. I think you call it something else. This is really a defining moment in sort of British, I guess the sense of British self, that the loss of the American colonies and the kind of end of the first British Empire. And in the aftermath of that, some interesting work has been done to to think about what it is actually that galvanizes the anti-slavery movement in that period after the American independence. So anti-slavery is not kind of born out of nothing at the beginning of the 19th century. There are a set of kind of crystallizing movements across the 18th century. And for anyone who wants to look into this in a lot more depth, David Bryan Davis has written a number of really seminal works on this, and lots of other people have built on that too. But really digging into this question of why did people turn against slavery? And of course, when I say people, why did people turn against slavery? Enslaved people have been against slavery for millennia. But why did societies that were benefiting from slavery start to turn against it? So there are all these questions about why this sort of dovetails with the Enlightenment and in ways sort of shapes how that turns out. Mm-hmm. One of the questions is, one of the theories, one of the arguments, and Christopher Leslie Brown has propounded this idea that Britain needed to kind of define itself as, sort of licking wounds after the loss of the colonies, think of ways to define itself as different and different to and better than the still slaveholding Americans. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of moral capital starts to emerge, this idea that, abolishing slavery as a way of kind of being different and being sort of morally superior is one argument. So I guess, you talk about the kind of competition with and sense of, long-term resentment and bitterness about the loss of that war is one element. But of course, so
the strategic shock for the British of losing, their American colonies, and yet recognizing, certainly some of the deep moral flaws in the American Revolution of still permitting slavery, certainly, especially in the southern states. Okay,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, another major feature of this, of course, is ongoing wars against France. Several decades in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. And so, actually, when the abolitionists, as they're called, these anti-slave trade activists, and very specifically anti-slave trade, they are moving, engaged in this very lively public campaign, trying to sort of move public opinion on the question of the slave trade using very sophisticated for the time, strategic communication about the question of what the transatlantic slave trade was as a moral wrong. It's very much shaped by and driven by an evangelical revival that's going on, and so shaped by an argument in particular. I don't want to simplify it too much, but driven very much by an argument that that God is very displeased by men holding other men in bondage because that prevents those men from being saved. And so there's kind of this sense of like fear, guilt, anxiety that's shaping this and driving this, but also kind of a sense of slavery potentially being maybe wrong. And so this movement, and I'm talking, something that spreads out certainly across the whole of metropolitan Britain. You see petitions then coming back in from the tiniest of villages, and these petitions can still be seen in the National Archives, these long rolls that are presented to Parliament. So many hundreds of thousands of these signatures that are being gathered, and this is fueling what feels like a very powerful grassroots movement, and it's giving a lot of power to the abolitionists, who, the MP abolitionists within Parliament, who are then pushing successive governments to pass this law against slave trading, to make slave trading illegal for British subjects and in British territorial waters. And this is happening, as I say, in the context of the wars against France. So it's actually the geopolitical context is really, really important, because two things that I would draw attention to. One is, up until the abolition of the slave trade, the late 1807, the British military was one of the biggest purchasers of slaves. So the West India regiments in the Caribbean are being, there's a huge number of enslaved Africans being bought from slave markets to become those soldiers. So the question of abolishing the slave trade means diminishing that supply. So that's a really big question. And then another question, which kind of the way in which the war is to the advantage of the slavery, anti-slavery argument, is that during wartime, of course, those listeners who are familiar with the law of the sea will know that you have extended rights of search and seizure. As the Royal Navy will have extended rights of belligerent search during wartime, and so they're able to use this extended set of rights in order to potentially prosecute a very successful naval suppression campaign. So the wars are very, very important in the backdrop here.
Okay. And as well, kind of the ascendance of British naval power in particular. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. In the aftermath of Trafalgar, yes, exactly. Yeah, we see Britain has the most powerful navy by quite a long way in the world, and this is a major asset, and actually a really important element of the identity of the British state at this point, and the kind of tools in the toolbox of foreign policy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now we're really getting into the heart of your what I understand to be the heart of your book's argument and your findings here. And I'll describe my understanding of it, and I want to read a brief excerpt from the book, and then give you a chance to elaborate on this, but also correct any possible misunderstandings I may have. So you describe how what we can certainly say the morally unambiguous good of abolishing the slave trade becomes, as implemented, much more morally ambiguous and often worse in terms of how the liberated, former enslaved people are treated, and not just incidentally, but as a matter of imperial policy by the British. And I just want to read a couple sentence excerpt from your book here, which I thought distills this pretty well. But again, we'll welcome your elaboration on this. So this is what you say. The story of the liberated Africans offers important clues about what the earliest proponents of abolition were actually trying to achieve. They were not seeking to rescue and rehabilitate people who had been enslaved, but rather to disrupt the slave trading ecosystem as a means to prevent the future enslavement of other Africans and to prove by almost any means necessary the economic viability of free labor. The liberated Africans were the afterthought of an intervention that was not intended to save them. But they were far from being passive recipients of British experiments in social engineering and far from being mere ciphers in Britain's efforts to rationalize its empire in humane and benevolent terms. Anyway, a lot going on there, but tell us a little bit more about that's a very interesting argument and some really revelatory findings, I thought.
Yes. So I think this argument might sound counterintuitive to some people, this idea that the abolitionists were not particularly interested in rescuing slaves. Mm-hmm. Certainly it was something that it dawned on me after a while. And I guess I'll unpack that a little bit. The slave trade is sometimes referred to as the triangular trade. You've got the trade goods coming from Britain, being sent down by sea. Of course, all trade is by sea at this point. Trade down to the West African coast, so things like cotton and textiles, alcohol, beads, firearms, that kind of thing, being sold then for enslaved Africans who then cross the Atlantic in what's known as the Middle Passage, famous Middle Passage. And that's if you Google Middle Passage, you see some of the abolitionist propaganda and the images that are used to make people realize the horrors of that experience. And in that experience, just to be clear to listeners who might not be familiar with this, you're talking about, for a lot of the period of the slave trade, slave traders trying to maximize their profit by packing in as many humans as possible into slave decks, which are temporarily constructed decks, which are not the height of a normal deck in these ships. So it could be 3.5 feet high. Sometimes people packed in and sort of laid down like bales of hay or something, or barrels of wine, really packed in. And
utterly ghastly conditions.
Absolutely awful. No, you're not talking kind of ventilation or well hydrated or anything like this. And these temporary decks also had these planks that would move around, and obviously the ships are rolling in the high seas, and you talk about huge weight of people moving with that, limbs being trapped, severed. So people are becoming extremely unwell. Of course, there's an awful lot of sickness. And so there's a huge amount of suffering that there's attendant with this Middle Passage, and a huge amount of loss of life. And that's when the journeys would go kind of according to plan. And then obviously if they got stuck in bad weather or becalmed for a while, then you start people, running out of water. And so it's a real, without wanting to belabor the point, a real horror show in this experience. So that Middle Passage and the life that it waited for enslaved people on the other side is an unequivocal bad. I know a lot of Americans are very familiar with slavery in the southern states of America and that history. There are some maps that are available through the UNESCO site, which are very easily accessible, that show, using infographics, using different sizes of arrows, the proportion of Africans that ended up in the southern states of the United States versus some of the other territories. And it's quite surprising for many to learn how many of those individuals ended up in Brazil or Cuba or the other islands of the Caribbean, and actually what a small proportion ended up in the southern states of the US. And obviously that's not a value judgment on anyone as an enslaver or not. It's just to say that the volumes of people absolutely huge, and the different sorts of lives that were possible at the other end of that experience were very, very, very significantly depending on where that enslaved person ended up. For some of these places, the life expectancy was under 7 years. They would be brought over and essentially worked to death because it was believed, and for many enslavers, was more profitable to just work people to death rather than keeping them in a good state of health, allowing their allowing them to marry, have children, and allowing that population to like renew itself in a kind of a natural sort of human way. A lot of these populations were just what the enslavers called like high levels of wastage. And so this is why you have huge numbers of people constantly coming in to replenish those populations and to keep that system profitable. The reason I'm telling you all this, other than context, which I love, is to say that there's a tension in this book, which I think is really important to draw attention to, which is that I'm not arguing at any point that, the British intervention was intended to be as bad as this. And so when I draw attention to some of the ways in which, people were experiencing exploitation and really, really bad outcomes, it's not to say that nothing else happened, and it's not to draw equivalence between the people who were working enslaved people to death in under 7 years compared to the people who were accepting and starting to utilize and exploit the labor of liberated Africans in other sites. What I'm trying to draw attention to in this is the tension that exists. So in somewhere like Sierra Leone, where people were brought ashore and accommodated in this liberated African yard, as it was called, or the King's Yard at different times, and then distributed in these different disposal pathways, either enlisted as soldiers or given out as apprentices, either to private individuals or to the state. Or then there are a number of other things that evolved that weren't part of the original policy, like creating these little model villages and trying to remake the culture and the communities of these people and sort of transform them into Christianized British subjects living in these kind of weirdly British little villages on the side of a mountain in Sierra Leone. Lots of different types of experiments about the way to, as it was called, dispose of these people. And so the tension I'm trying to explore in the book is, after about 1815, especially, some of these experiments were really quite ambitious and quite interesting things. There were systems of food rationing that were sometimes tailored to the health of an individual who needed it. There's provision of allotments of agricultural land, housing, materials to make houses, supplies of clothing, education for the children, adult education, technical training, access to medical treatment, judicial system. So for a not insignificant number of people, they were able to use some of this as a platform to then become really quite successful. So I'm talking about Sierra Leone in particular here. A number of people who go on to be really successful merchants and traders and their descendants who end up for a period really dominating the cultural life of the Freetown Peninsula, especially. So like this is a platform for a lot of people to be essentially rescued from slavery, right, and rehabilitated. So this is something that's really, really important. On the other hand, as you mentioned in your comments, there is this darker side to it, and the ways in which some of those people really are quite seriously exploited or neglected, or are not able to carve that out. And what I tried to explore in the book a little bit is how that system of power operated and the ways in which it sometimes intentionally led to that exploitation, sometimes just by failure and neglect, and what were the variables that led to different outcomes.
Yeah. Well, again, that's a great segue to my next question here, which you're starting to lead to, and this goes even to the very title of your book, of humanitarian governance, right? So tell us more about what this concept of humanitarian governance means, both in the early 19th century context, as you're writing about, and then maybe tracing it forward to today's context.
Sure. So for this, I was really, again, this is one of those examples of having some bit of extra time to really think about the so what of what your research is. And in that process, I engaged with the work of Alan Lester and Faye Dishart and Michael Barnett and various others too. And so Michael Barnett's work on the history of humanitarianism, he goes back into the 19th century and is looking for the origin of humanitarianism. And he identifies these two sort of strands. One about what you might call emergency humanitarianism. So that's the sort of disaster relief, the sort of rescue type humanitarianism. And then there's what he calls alchemical or maybe developmental humanitarianism. And so that's much more about trying to tackle root causes and remake communities and really invest in preventative resilience, that sort of thing. And he identifies two different points of origin for both of those things. And one of the things I was trying to do in my book was go back a little bit further, because I felt that when you look at these liberated African establishments, these different sites, including Freetown, the Bahamas, and various others too, where the emergency needs of people are being addressed, but then there's also this secondary attempt to resettle or create communities or to develop communities and build resilience. So I tried to sort of bring that back a little bit further. And I build also upon the work of Alan Lester and Faye Dussart, who are looking at this in the kind of 1820s and 30s, and saying that you start to see what you call a humanitarian register of governance start to infuse colonial governance. And again, I found this very interesting because they were finding this in the late 20s and 1830s. And I was seeing this in kind of 1808 and before. I was seeing where colonial administrators who were completely unprepared for the volume of arrivals that was coming through the slave trade. As you mentioned from the quote you took from the introduction there, they're the liberated Africans are the afterthought of an intervention that wasn't designed to save them. The Abolition Act just mentions these two things you can do to dispose of liberated Africans. It's apprenticeship or it's enlistment, but there was a sort of an expectation that would deal with it, because implicitly there was an expectation that young, fit, healthy men were going to be the people who were coming off these ships, and that the slave trade would be abolished quite quickly. So, use their labor, put them to good work, don't allow them to become idle, because that's a huge concern of the abolitionists at this time. But it's not going to lead to anything more elaborate. Actually, in these sites where people were coming ashore, and huge volumes, we're seeing. I say a minimum of 180,000 people, but we think it's actually quite a lot more, potentially well over 200,000. And so in those locations, you start to see colonial administrators, first of all, panic and completely fail. And then sort of different types of experiments start to emerge. In Sierra Leone, as I talk about a bit in the book, this is done in partnership with missionaries, and an ideas kind of comes together in the mind of a governor and one particular missionary to start to establish these settlements and start to try to create these model communities. But the language that's being used is very interestingly and kind of in an escalating way, really in that very humanitarian, very sort of asylum, refuge, benevolence, developmental. It is an interesting new tone that you start to see, and I think, as I tried to show in the book, these ideas start to kind of move across these different sites. They start to, I think, emerge sort of spontaneously in some areas, and then through communication with administrators who, of course, are all moving around. This is a very mobile period, and a lot of people who are kind of in posts for just a short period and then moving between them and bringing ideas and experiences with them. And so this is something I trace, this emergence of that moral vernacular, or this kind of moral vernacular about what the state is for. And I tried to connect that with other things that are emerging in this period. And so then, and then finally, I would say is that then I go forward then into the later period, and I look at some of the work of Michael Barnett and Didier Fasson and people like that, and see some of the echoes and resonances of that to the present day. One of the characteristics is, of course, as I and others have said, is that sort of dual compassion control thing, that any act of that kind of humanitarian governance that attempts to impose something on a non-voluntary population, even if it's framed as being in their best interest, it always involves some level of inequality, and it usually involves some element of giving people something they haven't necessarily asked for because you have decided it's in their best interests. Yeah. And that was one of the genealogies I was trying to trace.
Yeah, and that was, I know for me reading this, a revelatory insight, but also a somewhat discomforting one. And I think all of us should, be willing to reckon with that. And sometimes if it may even seem like we or policies we're supporting are of benevolent motives, there can also be that, and this is a very Nieburian theme, and our listeners know I'm a fan of Reinhold Niebuhr, but the mixed motives are dual nature, how there can be both ironic motives and ironic outcomes. Of course, a lot of your book is a history of ideas, it's a history of discourse, it's a history of policies, but it's also about real people, very interesting, complex people on the British side, on the African side. Tell us about any particular individuals who you found just especially intriguing or interesting. That's one of the great things about the craft of history is reviving or resuscitating, people long dead in the past for a contemporary audience and bringing them back to life in that way.
I'm really glad you asked that question, because it, is fundamentally a sort of a study of, policy and empire and, implementation and so on. But the real challenge in this field and in this kind of subfield of looking at this particular group of people, these liberated Africans who were the third largest stream of course migrants in the 19th century, but very much kind of only recently in recent years starting to be studied. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for that is the challenge is trying to connect with the personal stories and the kind of biographies of people. There's surprisingly, a lot of sources written about these people. There's a lot of documentary evidence about them in the Colonial Archive, but surprisingly little that kind of is someone's full narrative. And where you really get to grips with them. Large amounts of data and naming and kind of data about scarification and so on. But in the field of slavery studies, and especially looking at things like the transatlantic slave trade, there's always this risk of being overwhelmed by and kind of numbed by the scale and the size of the statistics, and to not really get that human face. And so it takes a lot of digging. And I was very fortunate in that there's a great group of scholars who've been working on this area in the sort of decade or so, at least before me, and I was able to have some really, really fruitful conversations and build upon some of their absolutely wonderful work. One thing I found when I was in the National Archives was a set of pension records. And I followed the trail with these. I ended up photographing about 3,000 of them and trying to do some statistical analysis on them. Because what intrigued me about them is that nowhere in these thousands of papers does it say liberated African, but by looking at where they were recruited, say in Sierra Leone, usually in this sort of period of time, it's extremely likely that they were liberated Africans, and especially when their place of birth is given and it's 2,000 miles away. People were. There's sort of 100 or more distinct ethnicities ending up in Freetown, and so the people who are being recruited there are typically liberated people. And so I was able to read through these pension records, and they are one of the few examples of really getting a picture of somebody. There was one man that jumps out at me called Private Charles Dickens. So this is an example of someone who's renamed in the process of their liberation being recorded. And I looked at his pension record, and he'd spent some almost 4,000 days in service between West Africa and the West Indies. He'd been a military labourer. He was discharged for reasons of medical unfitness, and it goes into quite a lot of detail about the total unfitness he had. They talked about the various injuries he had accumulated, including later in his career, the paralytic seizures. He had become completely paralyzed. They talked about his misdemeanors and his insubordination and the number of times he had been reprimanded or court-martialed. And that he was going to be, he planned to retire to Tobago after this because presumably he had friends or connections there. And you read through this whole pension record and you get to the end of it. At the time of his discharge, he was only 28 years old. And that really struck me, that this person had lived this incredibly sort of mobile life. I think it had a lot of violence, a lot of suffering, but also had this extremely different experience to what he would have had he ended up in a plantation in Cuba or Brazil. So there's a little bit of that where you're kind of thinking about the counterfactual a little bit. Much harder, as I say, these stories aren't very common. Much, much, much harder is to access the stories of women. There are very, very, very few biographical narratives written by liberated African women or about them. And I just found a few fragments. I wrote a paper for a journal called Gender and History recently, where I just really actually love the paper as me thinking about how hard it is to find these sources and really trying to reconstruct something from that. Yeah, it's a real challenge.
Yeah. But a very important service there too in the few stories that you can recapture and bring back to life. All right, a final question from me. And to tee up this question, I'm going to read two quotes, one from Michael Barnett's wonderful endorsement of your book, and the other a quote from your book. And this is going to deal with the present day implications, or whether policy applications, or more just how we think about these things. So in his wonderful blurb for your book, Michael Barnett says, Maeve Ryan demonstrates that the past is never past, but continues into the present. That is very interesting that he chose to seize on that theme. And then again, a quote from your book. Perhaps unavoidably then, the modern world's international humanitarian governance machine of intervention, and you put machine of intervention in quotes, rests upon the same inequalities of position, power, and possibility, which formed the basis for humanitarian action in the age of imperialism. Wow, that's very vivid. That's very evocative. Tell us more about what you mean about that, and particularly for policymakers or activists here in the year 2022, when we're having this conversation, who are focused on particularly humanitarian concerns, whether it's economic development, famine and poverty relief, anti-trafficking in persons, human rights, you name it, the whole gamut. So tell us more about your takeaways and applications for them and for us.
When I was thinking about how to conclude this book, I decided to write an epilogue rather than a conclusion. And the reason for this was I wanted to pose some questions and actually encourage readers to think about some of those tensions that existed within the book. As I mentioned earlier, that sort of tension between the self-consciously humanitarian attempts, that kind of humanitarian language that was being used, and the self-conscious attempts to try to rescue or rehabilitate or make useful, or however these different types of administrators thought about liberated Africans. It created these spaces to contain them, to make them safe from other people, to make them safe from re-enslavement, to make them safe from the kind of ill health they were experiencing and so on, but also to prevent them from leaving. So a lot of the people who arrived in these liberated African reception centers were not at liberty to leave. They also weren't at liberty to say, no thanks, I don't want to be enlisted, or I don't want to be apprenticed or anything else. They were expected to repay the debt of their salvation, and to essentially to support the wider enterprises of the imperial project, and to essentially kind of toe the line in terms of what they're being asked to do. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for this is there's a kind of anxiety about these people bringing disruptive influences into the colonies, or bringing epidemics or whatever else it is. So a lot of these sites are either resemble or are actually kind of prisons. So these liberated African yards that you see. And what I wanted readers to think about then in this epilogue was, where do we start to see echoes of this later on? So later into the 19th century, later on into the 20th and even the 21st century. And I drew attention to a couple of different things. The first was what a colleague called Aidan Forth calls an empire of concentration camps that emerges across a number of different British colonial sites in the late 19th century as a way of housing, of receiving and containing populations displaced by war and by disease. And you're talking like millions of people, millions and millions, tens of millions of people across these different concentration camps. And I think is probably well known to a lot of listeners, that term concentration camp emerges in this context. It's not actually exactly an invention of the 20th century. So these sites, again, they're framed around this kind of language, this discourse of rescue and salvation and asylum and refuge and so on. But of course, as Aidan Forth's book Barbed Wire Imperialism alludes to, I think quite evocatively in the title, there are watchtowers, there's barbed wire, there are overseers. And even more than that, the people contained in these camps are being put to work. Sometimes things like rock breaking, like absolutely no kind of economic benefit, but because of an anxiety that if they're not put to work in kind of productive use, that they will become idle or they will become disruptive influences. Fast forward again into the late part of the 20th century, the 21st century, and in the UK context, we see these immigration removal centres emerging. And again, this is coming from a sense that the disorderly and disruptive influences of failing or failed asylum seekers needs to be contained. Mm-hmm. And these centres are there. They're not because none of these people have committed any crimes. Mm-hmm. But these asylum seekers who are in the process of being deported or in some way kind of appealing against that, or trying to kind of engage in kind of last attempts to have their cases heard, many of whom, as a kind of a important side note, are actually modern slavery survivors. We have a problem in this country of treating recognized survivors of modern slavery, as first and foremost immigration cases and deporting them. So there's this weird, one of the reasons I wrote this is because I found this echo so horribly weird, that these immigration removal centers are being built quite often on prison design, mm-hmm. to contain survivors of slavery and to treat them as criminals, and the experience that's being created in there is one that is, and the reports that are written about this are extremely evocative and disturbing. It's not a good experience. It's an extremely traumatic and traumatizing experience. And I guess what I wanted to do is draw attention to this in the epilogue to think about, especially for British people, I think, to think about the very proud tradition we have in this country of having abolished the slave trade, and then several decades later abolished slavery, led this global campaign. And there's an identity, quite a proud identity in this country of having done great work in the humanitarian space, great work in kind of pioneering certain types of state humanitarianism, and that's all to the good. But what I wanted it to do was ask readers to think about what's happening out of sight in these immigration removal centres, and what's the genealogy that goes back to an earlier period.
Yeah. Well, no, a very powerful set of thoughts and concerns and questions to end on there, and a good reminder that history at its best generally should educate us, at times should inspire us, but also should disquiet us too, as we reflect on some of our present moments, and maybe the past is not so distant from us as we might otherwise like to think. So again, Dr. Ryan, thank you very much. A reminder to our listeners that we've been talking about this wonderful new book with Yale University Press, Humanitarian Governance and the British Antislavery World System, by Dr. Maeve Ryan from King's College London War Studies. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.